the war that began on the 24th of February, when Putin ordered his army to enter Ukraine, is not going according to plan. His army is stuck, their morale is low, their equipment is breaking down or not working. The soldiers are looting shops because they don't have enough food to eat or water to drink. They don't have tents. They don't have sleeping bags. They're sleeping in their trucks and their tanks and their lorries. Russia has been isolated. It has been cut off from the world economy. It has been cut off from SWIFT. The assets of its central bank have been frozen. And it is alone on the world, except for the great powers of Eritrea, North Korea, Belarus, and Syria. This is, in short, a catastrophe for Russia and one of the biggest blunders by a world leader in all of history. Let's start by looking at a map of Russia and the surrounding area. So, the map that I'm showing you now, you can see that there is Russia to the east, the big country, and next to its west, is Ukraine. Then above that is Belarus, and above that, by the Baltic Sea, are the three Baltic states: Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. All of these places were once a part of the Soviet Union, and you can see highlighted in the other corner, the opposite corner from that, Kazakhstan, which was also part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, obviously it was a communist, but it was basically the Russian Empire. It was a different name, didn't call itself an empire, it called itself a union, but it was an empire, a Russian empire. Ukraine and Belarus especially have very close ties culturally, linguistically, religiously, ethnically to Russia. They all come from the original Kievan Rus, which was established well over 1,000 years ago. And Kiev was its capital. It became Eastern Orthodox, and it became a part of the Byzantine world. Once the Byzantines were gone, Russia was by itself, and it became a separate civilization, isolated from the West, and that has colored Russia's history ever since. Another big thing that happened, which destroyed Kievan Rus and the Russian principalities, was the Mongol invasion. Many people say that this was one of the things that made Russia paranoid about outsiders and authoritarian through necessity. I've heard other people say that that's not the case, but I think there is some merit in that. Through the Mongol invasions and the weakness of the successor states to Kievan Rus, some parts became part of Lithuania and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, namely Belarus and most of Ukraine west of the Dnieper River. These places were ruled by Poles, who were Catholic, and they were more oriented towards the west. Poland, although it is a Slavic country and it is in Eastern Europe, as we would say if we're sitting in Western Europe, considers itself very much a part of the West. It's a Catholic country, it's not an Orthodox country. And the classic divide in Europe, East and West, has always been along religious lines. If you started out as Catholic, even if you became Protestant later, you were part of the West. If you were Orthodox, and Constantinople was your main city towards which you looked for religious teaching and leadership, you were part of the East. So Croatia is Western, Serbia is Eastern. Albania, beside, a bit Muslim, but there's some Catholics there, would be Western. Greece would be Eastern. Bulgaria and Romania, even though Romania has a Romance language, would be considered Eastern. But very much so, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Belarus, its name translates as White Russia, Belarusia. Ukraine, for a long time, was known as Little Russia, and the more Russian parts of Ukraine, Crimea and Donbass, the areas around Odessa, were known as Novorossiya, New Russia. So you can see where someone like Putin and people around him would come to the conclusion that these places really are just a part of Russia. After all, they're called Little Russia, or another name for Ukraine was Black Russia, because of its deep, fertile black soils. So we have all these different sorts of names. We have Great Russia, which was the area around Moscow. We had White Russia, modern-day Belarus. We had Little Russia, or Black Russia, the Ukrainian part of modern Ukraine, and then New Russia, the area that was taken from various khanates that were loyal to Istanbul and the Sultan. That area was cleared out of the various Tatars and others and settled with ethnic Russians. So this was the prelude. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that all of these places were suddenly now separate. There was, in 1990, 1991, a slight chance that Ukraine, Belarus, and even Kazakhstan would remain with Russia, and perhaps even a few others like Armenia, to create a new union that wouldn't be socialist or Soviet, but would be the inheritor of USSR. Didn't work out. Yeltsin pulled Russia out of the Soviet Union, and for a few days, Kazakhstan was the USSR. So you can see, it's all a bit of a mess. In this video, you can see quite clearly a convoy of Russian trucks and armored vehicles that have been attacked and destroyed. I'm assuming there are bodies in the area, perhaps under the snow, but even if they ran and survived, they're going to have a very hard time of it. If they haven't got food or water or shelter, and if they're in a hostile environment where nobody likes them, no one wants to help them or greet them as liberators, as Putin seems to have thought they'd be, they're going to be in some serious trouble. This is just one video that I found. There are many others. There are videos of Russians looting shops because they have no food. Some of the food, I've found out, the rations, the military rations, was 7 years out of date. The trucks that we can see in many videos, they have tires that burst. They burst because these vehicles have been sat in some parking lot somewhere, in some military parking lot, with the sun shining on them, weakening the tires because they should be used on a regular basis or moved. The tires should be changed regularly as well. But it does seem that the corruption within the Russian military, where various people take their cut, where things are not done properly because it's easier and cheaper not to do it, and just pocket the money yourself, it seems that this is coming back to bite the Russians in the behind. This is genuinely unbelievable how bad the organization within the Russian army seems to have been. The invasion started on the 24th of February, and for the first day or two it looked as if they might just storm Ukraine and take it within 2 weeks, 3 weeks maybe. Now they're a week into it, and they're still almost stuck in the same place that they were when this invasion started. Yes, they've made some advances, they've surrounded some cities, but it doesn't look like they've been able to do very much. But let's just say that Russia does win. Let's say they take the entire country. What happens then? They'll have to occupy a country that hates them. Let's say they decide to put in a puppet government. That puppet government is not going to have much legitimacy in the world, and is not going to have very much legitimacy within Ukraine itself. There will be a government in exile. Everyone will be looking to that government as a genuine government. So there's not really much that Putin can do with this government. The only thing right now he can do is try to negotiate with the legitimate government that's there to get them to agree to lose a lot of their land, which I don't think that they will do. He's in a bind right now. I think what he thought was going to happen was that Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, would flee, that law and order would collapse, that everyone would welcome the Russians, or at least not oppose them, and that they would be relatively okay with having the Russians in control. He's miscalculated, because now Zelensky, who had an approval rating of 25%, now has an approval rating in the 90s. Their parliament, the Rada, had an approval rating down around 10%. And now that's gone up as well, because so many MPs are out in the streets of Kiev with guns, willing to fight. This has given legitimacy to the Ukrainian government and to Ukrainian institutions. It has united Ukraine in a way that probably Putin never thought would happen. And most importantly, Russia's economy is now being destroyed day by day. They've lost access to Western markets. They've lost access to world markets. They can't pay for anything. They can't move anything. Maersk, one of the largest shipping companies in the world, has said they will not go into any Russian port, carry any Russian goods. It's one of the largest shipping companies in the world, and there's another shipping company that I can't remember the name of. They've done the same. They're the two largest shipping companies in the world. So effectively, Russia cannot import or export, not just because of the ships, but because they can't pay for it. They don't have access to SWIFT anymore. They can't electronically transfer funds. The oligarchs, their vessels are being seized in Germany, in France, in Italy. Houses are being seized. Jets are being seized. The ones who managed have been able to fly their jets and sail their boats trying to get to a neutral port. But that's only going to be a stopgap. They can't keep ahead of that forever. third countries that do not support these sanctions are going to end up being sanctioned themselves. Russia is almost, not quite, but it's getting there, almost as isolated as North Korea and Iran now. This is going to have a massive toll on the Russian economy, Russians themselves, and the world. It's an absolute catastrophe. And if the Russians have any sense, or if the people in charge have any sense, the oligarchs, the generals, etc., they will remove Putin. They will push him aside. Hopefully he can have a nice retirement in his palace in Sochi. And they will withdraw from Ukraine. Because if they don't, Russia is risking everything it has built up and achieved since the fall of the Soviet Union. This is a very dangerous situation right now. Russia could lose it all. The danger doesn't just come from protests by Russians within Russian Russia. And I say Russian Russia for a very good reason. Hang on in there. There are Russians who are protesting this. We've seen some of the scenes in St. Petersburg and in Moscow. There are small groups because it is very difficult and dangerous to protest against this government, especially at this time. But there are Russians protesting. There are Russians who oppose Putin and his power. There are many Russians who just want to live normal lives and want their country to be a normal country. They don't want to be in a conflict with the West. A lot of them like the West or want to be kind of like it. Not all of them, but not completely. They are Russians. But they don't have anything specifically personally against the West. They want the same sort of gadgets as we do, and the same clothes, and the same, want to have a life and flat and have some kids and live relatively well. They would like a government that isn't corrupt. They'd like a government that doesn't ruin the economy every decade or so. But Russians are not the only people within Russia. First, let's have a look at this map of what was East Prussia, now Kaliningrad, and it is completely surrounded on all its land borders by NATO states. Lithuania to the north, Poland to the south. It is quite a distance away from Russia proper. This used to be part of Germany until the end of the Second World War. Stalin wanted to push the Soviet borders west, and he wanted to keep the Polish territories that he had taken in 1939 when he and Hitler had made an agreement to split Poland between them and to invade it and conquer it. Funny how one guy was the bad guy for that and the other got rewarded for it. So at the end of the war, he decided that, well, he wanted to keep his territory. The Allies weren't very happy with that, but he suggested, well, just give Poland some of the German territory in the east, eastern Germany, which they did. So Pomerania, Silesia, and half of East Prussia became Polish, and the other half of East Prussia became Russian. There were some plans to make it part of Lithuania. But Lithuania didn't want it because they thought, well, there'd be too many Russians in Lithuania, so they said, nah, you can keep it. So Russia kept it. At the end of and that didn't matter at the time because they're all part of the Soviet Union. At the end of the Cold War, Russia ends up with this piece of territory that's hundreds of miles from Russian territory. It's quite handy. It's got a warm water port, and it's quite far into the west, so it's a good bit of real estate to have. But it is cut off. And now, with all the sanctions, I'm wondering how any planes are going to get from Russia proper to Kaliningrad. I don't know if there'll be any exceptions because it's an area that's cut off from the rest of Russia. There possibly are some sort of legal loopholes that they can use, but what if there isn't? Trying to get a ferry down there, trying to cross the border, like how are they going to do that? It's going to be very difficult. And this is a place that is weak for Russia. Now, if they control Belarus, they're a lot closer to East Prussia, Kaliningrad. But they still aren't connected. They would need a land corridor, the border between Poland and Lithuania. It's not very far, but well, that could mean a war. But what we've seen over the last few days, last week or so, is that Putin is willing to go to war. But will he last? That's the big question. Now, one of the great dangers is that Putin loses this war. And, being humiliated, there could be parts of Russia that aren't really Russian that could decide that this could be a good time to rise up and push the Russians out. They've just been humiliated by Ukraine. Imagine what the Chechens and the Ingush could decide to do. What about the Tatars in Tatarstan? What about the Bolsheviks, or whatever they're called, next to Tatarstan? There's a lot of different ethnic groups and a lot of different territories that are not majority Russian, or just barely majority Russian. Russian demographics are terrible. Russians as a group are shrinking. Already since the Soviet Union, the population has dropped by at least 10 million. And by the end of this century, if things continue to go as they are going, the population could drop to 80 million from its present 140 million. There are others who say it could even be worse. Now, I don't know. And we also must not count out that there could be a baby boom in 20 years, or tomorrow, the start of a baby boom. So perhaps the population will increase or stay the same. But the way things are going, we know how many 1-year-olds there are, how many 2-year-olds, how many 10-year-olds, how many 20-year-olds. That is demography. So we know that in 20 years' time, the 40-year-olds, well, those are going to be the 20-year-olds. In 30 years' time, the 40-year-olds, those are going to be the 10-year-olds, etc., etc., etc. And the way it's going, Russia is going to have massive problems. They're dying out. They're not going to die out as a race, but there will be a point at which they hit the natural equilibrium, and we don't know when that is. So between economics, demographics, its military, Russia is in a very dangerous spot where it could actually start falling apart itself. We already had the collapse of its empire, the Soviet Union. Imagine if Russia itself started to fracture. The Russian army has just been dealt humiliating defeat. Well, the Chechens, the Ingush, the Tatars, others, the Tuvans, could all go their own way. Why not? If they can't beat the Ukrainians, they'd give it a go, and maybe they'd win. That's the worst case scenario. That is why Putin needs to go, and why they need to stop this war. because it could tear Russia apart.